Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank Kati and the Finnish Environment Minister for joining our discussion related to GMOs and new genetic engineering techniques, because it is a topic which is very important for the organic sector. But it's also important for the whole farming sector in Europe, the conventional sector, because the vast majority of the farming sector in Europe is GMO-free. And GM8 is only grown on a few hundred hectares in the south of Spain. So retailers, processors in Europe, they want GMO-free products. And consumers in Europe have constantly expressed their rejection of the use of GMOs in agriculture and food, and their preference for GMO-free products. So it's a very important topic. So once again, thank you very much for explaining why the Finnish presidency took the initiative to have this council decision. And with all due respect, I will challenge some of the interpretations and statements that you showed in your presentation. I have a long presentation. I'm going to try to make it a bit shorter, so bear with me if I go very fast on some of the slides. So, first of all, I will first explain the position of the organic sector on GMOs in general. As you know, organic is regulated at the European level. We have an organic regulation, and this organic regulation bans the use of GMOs in the organic production process. And this will continue to be the case with the new organic regulation that will enter into force in 2021. When we talk about new genetic engineering techniques, what are we talking about? We're talking about a list of different new techniques which were indeed developed after 2001, when the new GMO legislation was adopted. But one point I would like to stress, first of all, is that we talk sometimes about new mutagenesis technique, all right? This refers to the term mutagenesis, which refers to a technique that was indeed implemented since the 60s. But the new techniques are very different from the mutagenesis that was done in the 60s and 70s. Because basically, mutagenesis at the time was done by, you want me to speak? Okay, not closer, but further away from the microphone. That's clear, I get it. So, mutagenesis, as it was done before, was done by irradiation or by chemical treatments of a whole plant or of a seed. And this is very different from new techniques because you add the repair mechanisms on the whole plant that were still operational, let's say. So we're talking about very different things, even though sometimes the same term is used. The most common term that is used today for these new techniques is genome editing. All right, and that includes in particular the techniques most of you have heard about, which is CRISPR-Cas9. Genome editing, to make it very short, with GMOs which are currently in the market, they use transgenesis. So you take a gene from one species, and you use a bacteria, a plasmid, or you use a gene gun to put a gene into the organisms that you want to modify, okay? With the new techniques, basically, you can directly modify the DNA in the plant without necessarily adding a gene from another species, all right? But from a legal point of view, as it was clarified by the European Court of Justice, this is still genetic engineering, and this is still a GMO. So this difference between transgenesis and other techniques is not the good legal reasons for excluding these new techniques from the GMO legal framework. So, the organic movement discussed this already in 2015 and basically found that according to the organic movement, there are no legal or technical reasons to exclude these new techniques from the GMO legislation. It was also discussed at the international level by IFOAM Organics International, and the position was adopted by the General Assembly of IFOAM in 2017 in India. Well, to make a long story short, the global organic movement also considered that these new genetic engineering technologies were not compatible with the principles of organic farming. And these decisions were taken before the clarification of the European Court of Justice in 2018. But what the Court of Justice did is basically to confirm our interpretation that these new techniques are indeed genetically modified organisms that fall in the scope of the EU legislation on GMOs. I included a few slides because the organic movement has also expressed its views of what should be organic plant breeding. Because we all agree that we need innovation, and we all agree in particular that we need innovation in plant breeding. But the way innovation is done in organic farming is based on a systemic approach, where the whole system is considered and is looked at, and you try to improve the whole system, basically, with not only the plant, the varieties, but the strategy you use to prevent pests and diseases, to ensure soil fertility, of course. You know all these things better than me, especially as organic farmers. But basically, the organic sector also have a view that we need to develop plant breeding and organic plant breeding, according to the principles of organic farming. And one of the principles which is important in organic farming is the principle of care, which basically is a way to reaffirm the importance of a precautionary principle, which is also a principle which is enshrined in the EU legislation, and that's very important. So the current regulatory situation, we have this directive from 2001 on the deliberate release of GMOs in the environment. And since we have a Court of Justice ruling since last year, there is no more legal uncertainty. The legal status of this new technique is very clear. They are GMOs, and they should be regulated as GMOs as well. And we also believe that the current legislation is fit for purpose. The questions, some remaining questions, are indeed, how do we detect products made with these new genetic engineering techniques, and how do we implement the legal framework? But we believe that we do not need a legal proposal, because the Council decision that you presented is asking for the Commission for a study, but also, if appropriate, for a legal proposal. And if we have a legal proposal, what is it if not to modify the GMO legislation to exempt some of the new techniques from the legal framework as well? So that's why we are very concerned by this move from the Council as well. So we have a legislation, it applies to the new techniques, and it's fit for purpose for the new techniques as well. What we need now is for the Commission and Member States to implement the legal framework on GMOs so that it applies to CRISPR-Cas9 and other techniques. Why do we need regulation of the new techniques and genome editing techniques? Because these techniques are very powerful and efficient at modifying the genome. And I think what is important to know is that they are not as precise as it is often claimed. I mean, we often hear the metaphor about the genetic scissors, implying that the modifications are extremely precise and sometimes can only affect a few base pairs in the DNA. In reality, it is not the case. So, I'm sorry for these long slides with a lot of technical and scientific information. I'm not a scientist myself. Once again, to make a long story short, you can have a lot of unintended consequences with the use of CRISPR-Cas9, meaning that you can have modification of a genome at many, many places in the genome, much beyond the places where you intend to do the modification. Okay? We refer to that to off-target modifications. And part of the problem is that they are usually not detected, this off-target modification, because the techniques used to analyze the genome, they're often based on PCR sequencing, which is the detection method which applies to the current GMOs. You basically find what you're looking for, because you have a genetic sequence, and PCR allows to multiply it. So if you're looking for a specific genetic sequence or a specific modification, you will find it. But you will not find the modifications that the detection method does not allow you to find. I'm not sure if I'm very clear, but basically, when you apply more advanced technique to analyze the genome, like whole genome sequencing, you realize that even with new techniques like CRISPR-Cas9, you have many modifications at many places of the genomes, which you were not aiming at and which were not expected. You also have further modification at the target sites as well. So these techniques are not as precise as they are sometimes presented. And because you have unwanted changes, unwanted consequences, this is why you need a risk assessment. Because these changes can also have implications on the development of the plants, on the alteration of a natural composition of a plant as well, the reaction to stress, and other types of effects as well, which needs to be evaluated, which can have an effect on the organism itself, but also in on the ecosystems in which the organism is introduced. There is a mention of gene drive. Have you heard about gene drive? Okay, gene drive is a specific application of CRISPR-Cas9. It aims at making genetically modified organisms and on making sure that the traits you introduce in the organisms can spread very rapidly in population. The example which is always put forward is GM mosquitoes. Okay, they modified mosquitoes to make them sterile, so as to eradicate all population of mosquitoes. Okay, they did experiments in Brazil related to that, and they realized that contrary to what they expected, not all the GM mosquitoes had the sterility trait, and that they crossed with local populations, making them fitter. There was a publication this year in Nature. So, we're talking about technologies which can have a very far-reaching impact, all right? We're really talking about releasing into the environment genetically modified organisms. Some of them can be targeted at eliminating whole wide populations of living organisms as well. So this also raises very important ethical issues, which are also discussed at the international level in the context of a Convention on Biodiversity and the Biosafety Protocol. Just maybe one example will be clearer. In the US, a company called Recombinetics used, I think, Talon, one of the new techniques, gene editing techniques, to make hornless cattle. They only modified, according to them, 200 base pair of DNA to introduce basically a gene which is present in other bovine population, so that the cows don't grow horns. All right? They didn't ask for approval because in the US, GMOs are actually not regulated. They are deregulated. I'm talking about the current GMOs already on the market. They are considered as substantially equivalent. According to them, everything was fine for the cows. But still, they asked the opinion of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, because they have around 15 cows modified. And instead of incinerating them, they wanted to basically sell them as meat, as steak and hamburgers, because it was much cheaper, and they wanted to test the FDA reaction. And by chance, the bioinformatician of the FDA realized that actually, in the genome of the cows, you not only had the transformation which they were aiming at, okay, to make the cows hornless, but you also had DNA from the bacteria, from the plasmid used in the genetic engineering process. This was completely unexpected, and it was not detected at all by the company itself, So this is an example, once again, that you can have unintended consequences and unintended modifications linked to the genetic engineering process itself. So, in this case, there is now no way that they would be authorized for food in the US. You have DNA from the bacteria, which was also inserted as an unintended consequence. This is just another example that shows that, yes, we need a proper risk assessment also for these new techniques. And Another fact is that all GM technologies are also used when you use new genetic engineering techniques, like vectorization, for example, or cell cultivation, which can also lead to unintended effects. And beyond that, are we able to understand the consequences of both of the intended changes and the intended changes in complex biological systems and in complex ecosystems? And what about the impact of these modifications on the gene regulation mechanisms, what we call epigenetics? We know now, I mean, in biology, a few decades ago, they thought that, one DNA leads to one RNA that leads to one protein. We know now that it's much more complex than that. We have mechanisms, which we only begin to understand, that control the expression of genes. Two identical organisms with exactly the same DNA in different environments, they will express different traits as well. And currently this is not evaluated. So we need a risk assessment for these new technologies. We need a risk assessment which is linked to the genetic engineering process itself, because it's the genetic engineering process itself which can lead to unintended consequences. Okay? I'm saying that because we hear sometimes that such GMOs modified with new techniques would be identical to natural organisms, and that only the product should be evaluated. And if it's identical to natural organisms, then why should we evaluate it? According to many scientists, this reasoning is wrong because you can have unintended consequences because of the genetic engineering process itself. And this is the basis for the risk assessment in the EU and at the global level as well. But then we could also consider evaluating the trait itself. When I'm talking about the traits, I mean the characteristics that you want the GMOs to have. For example, 80% of the GMOs which are on the market today, they are herbicide tolerant. They are tolerant to an herbicide. The most famous example is the GM soya Roundup Ready. It's tolerant to Roundup, to glyphosate. So you can spray the glyphosate on all your field. It kills everything, the weeds, except the GM plant. All right? This is the reality of GMOs today on the market for 80% of them. The rest of them, they produce their own insecticide protein, VT. This is what we call a trait. This is not evaluated today. This should also be evaluated, but assessing the trait should not replace risk assessment based on the process in the first place. Another reason why we need these techniques to continue being regulated is the need for traceability and labeling. Once again, from an environmental point of view, we're talking about living organisms which are able to reproduce and multiply in the environment, all right? So from a regulatory oversight point of view, from an environmental perspective, that's also one of the reasons why we have traceability in the EU. In case you realize that genetically modified organisms presents problems, once it has been released, okay? We have post-market monitoring and we realize that actually this has negative consequences for health of the environment. How do you recall the organisms from the environment and from the food chain if you have no traceability? It's basically impossible. So we need traceability for environmental reasons and for environmental and health safety. But we also need traceability to guarantee the choice of breeders, farmers, processors, and consumers not to use GMOs as well. European consumers want to have a choice. They want to know what's in their food, and they want to have a choice to buy food products for which no GMOs was used in the production process. If we have a new legal proposal for the new techniques, exempting them either from risk assessment or from traceability, it would amount to taking away the right of European consumers to know what is in their food. And I think that's a rather bizarre way of encouraging the use of new techniques, hiding the information from consumers. And the organic sector needs this information as well. The reason why the organic sector is able to have GMO-free production process and products, it's thanks to the EU traceability and labeling system, okay? Because when a company wants to put a GMO on the market, they have to provide the means of identification of the GMOs and the means to make it traceable all along the production chain. So this allows organic producers to have access to GM-free seeds in the first place. And it's also true for conventional producers. If we don't have traceability, there is no way to know where these organisms are in the environment, in the fields, and in the food chain. And it means that the costs, if it's ever possible, of ensuring GMO-free products are on the organic producers. And we already have this experience with the GMOs which are currently on the market. Back in the 2000, we had the whole debate on coexistence. I don't know if you remember. The Commission was saying it should be possible to grow GMOs and organic products alongside. So we had discussions at the national level about distances between fields and all these things. Experience shows that coexistence in most cases is not possible because you always have contamination, and in any case it's very costly. And the cost is on the organic producers or on the conventional GMO producer, which are the majority in Europe as well. So I already talked about the consumer right to know and the right of farmers and breeders to use seeds which are free of genetic modification. And once again, the whole EU market is GMO-free, even though we have more than 80 GMOs approved for import and use in food and feed in Europe. Okay, it's legal to have GMOs on the market, but the market doesn't want it. European consumer doesn't want it. Just a quick point on detections. I mean, we often hear that detection is not possible for the new technique. It's not possible yet with detection methods we used for the existing GMOs, which are mostly based on PCR. But according to scientists, these technical problems with detection can be overcome. Gene-edited products that are already on the market are detectable due to unique patterns. And as far as we know, there are only two gene-edited products on the market in the US and Canada. It's the Cybus oilseed rape on the one end and the Calyx soya with altered nutritional composition. Two products on the market in the US. So it should be possible to ask the companies that have marketed this product and to ask the US authorities to provide the European Union with a genetic modification that allow the development of detection methods. And it's actually a legal obligation, thanks to the EU GMO legislation, that companies that put GMOs on the market provide to the national authorities and to the European network of laboratories with the genetic sequences that allows to develop detection methods. So that's possible. Unknown gene-editing products and imports. Here as well, it's also possible to develop detection methods and strategies as well, based on a matrix approach. And we have very high-level scientists who have actually worked on identification of illegal GMO import in the past. I don't know if you remember, in 2006, we had issues with accidental import of illegal GM rice from China. You know, they had experimental GM rice cultivation in China, but it ended up in the food chain, and it contaminated imports of rice to the EU. The Commission had to develop ways to detect these unknown GMOs for which we didn't have genetic sequences. But we managed to do it thanks to a matrix approach. You look for information which are in the patents, for example. Scientists like to take the comparison with police inquiry, basically. So you have ways to develop such detection methods as well. And last but not least, we mentioned traceability already. Traceability is cheap and easy. It's based on documentations, making sure that the operators all along the production chain have to provide the documentation if their products are products from genetic engineering. And this is working very well. Detection methods are only there to prevent fraud in the traceability system, basically. So, it's wrong to say that detection is not possible. What we need to do is precisely to fund research projects to develop reliable detection methods like it was done in the 90s for the current GMOs. For those of you who have followed this debate on GMOs, like I have for quite some time now, in the 90s, there was no traceability and detection of GMOs. The first GMOs were put in the market in 96. And at the time, the European Commission was saying, we cannot detect them, And if we put in place traceability, it will be too expensive. It will raise the cost of products because commodities are traded in bulk, too complicated, too expensive. Member states at the time had to force the Commission to make a new legislation. That's why we had a moratorium on new GMO authorization at the time, which was, by the way, attacked by GMO exporting countries, the US and Argentina and Canada at the time, to put pressure on Europe. But Europe stood firm, and we managed to put in place a traceability system which is working very well and which is a reference worldwide at the global level. So what do we need to do now? The legal situation is actually very clear. What we need to do is to make sure that we fund research programs to develop appropriate detection methods. We do not believe that we need new legislation for new techniques. Once again, we believe that existing legislation is fit for purpose. And it could be interesting to have new studies on how we implement the legal situation, in particular regarding detection. But such new studies should not delay the implementation of legal framework on GMOs. And there should be a clear mandate and EU funding for the network of GMO laboratories in the EU to develop such methods. And then the European Union should be very clear towards the US and Canada, which are two of countries growing gene-edited crops, that their exports have to be certified as GMO-free. And last but not least, no patents on plants and animals which have traits and genetic information that can be found in nature or that can be obtained by conventional breeding should not be allowed. And same at the national level. National authorities need to carry out the necessary controls to ensure that the imports are free from GMOs, including the new techniques as well. And I will start with a few slides related to patents on seeds and animals, because we cannot talk about GMOs or new genetic engineering techniques without talking about who controls this technology and who benefits from these technologies. One of the main reasons for the introduction of GMOs by companies like Monsanto in the 90s is intellectual property rights, patents. Because as you know, in Europe, seeds are not protected by patents. Patents give you a monopoly for 20 years on a certain product. In contrast, plant varieties in Europe are protected by plant variety rights, a much lighter form of intellectual property, which allows the circulation of genetic resources. Why? Because a breeder can take a variety which is protected by a plant variety right and use it for its own research purpose and for developing its own varieties. So you have a circulation of genetic resources. This is not possible with the patent. You need to ask the permission or pay the patent holder, okay? So having patents on seeds is a real threat to the European model of innovation in breeding. They also foster market concentration. I mean, this slide is already updated. Huh? You know that we have 4 companies now only doing pesticides and biotech products. We have ChemChina. They bought Syngenta 2 years ago. I think they have a turnover of more than 100 billion euros. It's a Chinese company now, even though they bought Syngenta. We have Bayer Monsanto. They merged last year. You all know Monsanto, very famous for many of the products they put on the market, including DDT, PCBs, Agent Orange, and of course GM maize and GM soya, and glyphosate. Of course, they've been bought by Bayer. We have Dow and DuPont, the 2 US companies that merged, and the 4th one is BASF, another German company now. And these 4 companies account for more than 60% of the seed markets. So huge market concentration. We have more and more patents which are granted in Europe, which cover not only products from genetic engineering. I think it's fine to have a patent on the genetic engineering process because it's a real invention, but they also cover de facto conventional breeding and varieties obtained by conventional breeding, because the European Patent Office considers that whatever the techniques you have used, you get a patent on the product. And if, let's say, if a genetic engineering process allows you to make a plant with a certain, I don't know, content in oleic acid, all right? The company will have monopoly over all the varieties which have this level of oleic acid, even though you can also obtain these varieties by conventional breeding. This is the whole problem with the increasing number of patents we have on conventional breeding. So, I will skip this as well. It's also a concern for the organic movement, but also for conventional farmers, patents on seeds, and also animals, because new genetic engineering techniques, they are also used a lot on animals. We had the example of course, as well. And patents are a way for these companies to get more of the added value in the food production chain, okay? So when a company has a patent on the seeds, they claim property on all the use of the seeds downstream in the food production chain. Why do you think a company like Carrefour, it's the second biggest retailer in the world, opposed GMOs and was one of the first companies to commit to propose GMO-free products to their customers? Simply because they understood that with GMOs and patents, it was a way to give more power and more of added value, once again, to the companies selling the inputs. They sell the chemicals, but also the seeds. And I will stop here. I mean, the reason why Monsanto went into GMOs in the first place, Monsanto is a chemical company, right? They've produced glyphosate for years. But the patent of glyphosate was ending at the end of the 80s. So they had the brilliant idea to propose genetically modified organisms which could be used in conjunction with glyphosate, so that they could sell both the glyphosate but also the seeds. So they bought many seeds companies to force them to put the traits, the Roundup-ready traits, and to access the germplasm as well. They called it combined marketing. And when a US farmer buys the GM seeds, he's forced by contract to buy the Roundup from Monsanto instead of a generic herbicide made of glyphosate as well. So, for all these reasons, the organic movement is opposed to the use of GMOs, which are clearly not considered as compatible with principles of organic farming. We believe that the legal situation is very clear, and it's a good thing that the EU legislation on GMOs also apply to these new techniques. What we need now is the development of detection methods to properly implement the existing legislation. Thank you.